5 degrees below zero. That's how cold it was on October 27th, 1915, when Ernest Shackleton stood on the ice and watched his ship die. The Endurance groaned like a living thing. Her timbers cracked with sounds like gunfire. Ice, that patient enemy, was crushing her slowly, deliberately, squeezing the life from her wooden hull. 28 men stood watching, their breath freezing in the air, understanding with terrible clarity that everything had changed. But this ending was also a beginning, and to understand how these men came to be stranded on a sheet of ice in the most hostile place on Earth, we must go back to where it all started. London, 1914. Ernest Shackleton was a man possessed by dreams that would not let him rest. At 40 years old, he had already achieved what most men only fantasize about. He was a knight, famous throughout the British Empire for his polar explorations, but fame wasn't enough. Glory wasn't enough. Shackleton had tried twice to reach the South Pole, and twice he had been defeated. A Norwegian, Roald Amundsen, had claimed that ultimate prize. The failure burned inside Shackleton like acid, so he conceived a new dream, to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. 1,500 miles through the most brutal environment on Earth. No one had ever done it. No one had even tried. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was exactly what Shackleton needed. He was not a man built for ordinary life. His wife and children barely knew him. He had once written to his wife with painful honesty, "Sometimes I think I am no good at anything but being away in the wilds." This wasn't modesty. It was truth. Shackleton wanted greatness. He wanted his name carved into history, and he would sacrifice anything to get it. Legend says he placed an advertisement in London newspapers. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success. No one has ever found the original advertisement. Perhaps it never existed, but the words captured something essential about what Shackleton offered. Not money, not comfort, but a chance to test yourself against the impossible. 5,000 men applied. They came from everywhere. Cambridge scientists and hardened sailors, dreamers and misfits, men who were bored with ordinary life, who wanted something more than a steady job and a safe existence. Harry McNish, a Scottish carpenter, saw the warning that return was doubtful and thought, "That's exactly what I want." These were men who would rather die doing something extraordinary than live doing nothing at all. Shackleton chose 27 men to join him. Frank Worsley, a New Zealand captain who loved ramming his ship through ice with reckless joy. Frank Hurley, an Australian photographer whose camera would capture images that would outlive them all. Dr. Alexander Macklin, a surgeon who would chronicle everything with brutal honesty. Leonard Hussey, who brought a banjo that Shackleton called vital mental medicine. And Frank Wilde, Shackleton's closest friend, a man who understood the boss better than anyone. Not everyone thought it was a good idea. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, dismissed Shackleton as a mere adventurer. "Enough life and money has been spent on this sterile quest," Churchill wrote. "The pole has already been discovered. What is the use of another expedition?" It was a reasonable question, but Shackleton wasn't reasonable. He was a romantic, chasing something that had nothing to do with reason. After 7 frantic months of preparation, the Endurance was ready. Shackleton had named her after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." The ship was strong, built specially to withstand the crushing pressure of polar ice. In her hold were supplies for 2 years, 69 Canadian sled dogs, and equipment for the transcontinental march. Everything was planned. Everything was ready. Then the world caught fire. August 1914. War exploded across Europe. Britain mobilized for what everyone thought would be a short, glorious conflict. Shackleton immediately telegraphed the Admiralty, offering his ship and men for the war effort. The response came in a single word: proceed. Even as young men marched off to die in France, the Empire could spare 28 souls for one last great journey of exploration. The Endurance sailed south, stopping first at the island of South Georgia, the last outpost of humanity before Antarctica. It was a desolate place, home to a handful of whaling stations where rough men stripped blubber and rendered oil in conditions that would break most people. A local priest called them fallen creatures at odds with life. Shackleton understood these men. Like them, he was most comfortable far from civilization. At South Georgia, the whalers gave him bad news. The Weddell Sea was choked with ice, the worst conditions they'd seen in years. They advised waiting, but Shackleton couldn't wait. He was 40 years old. This was his last chance. Every day of delay risked everything. For all of November, he paced the shores, watching, waiting, weighing the odds. His men grew restless. Finally, in early December, Shackleton made his decision. They would go. On December 5th, 1914, the Endurance departed South Georgia and headed south into the Weddell Sea. Navigator Hubert Hudson wrote to his father, "Dear old Dad, just a line before we sail. I think we shall do well. I hope to be home again within 19 months and go straight to the front. What a glorious age we live in." Such innocent words, such terrible prophecy. 3 days out they met the enemy. Pack ice stretched to every horizon, a vast broken field of floes and pressure ridges. Between the ice were narrow channels of open water called leads, and through these leads the Endurance had to navigate. It was like threading a needle while the needle kept moving. Captain Worsley took to it with boyish enthusiasm. Dr. Macklin watched with amusement as Worsley deliberately rammed ice floes at full speed, loving the shock and crunch as the ship drove through. Some days they made good progress. Other days the ice stopped them completely. It was slow. It was frustrating, but they were moving forward. 6 weeks later they were only 100 miles from the Antarctic continent. So close. 100 miles from where they would establish their base and begin the historic crossing. They could almost touch it. Then the ice changed. It became thick, heavy, resistant. The ship slowed to a crawl. Worsley made a decision. Instead of forcing through and exhausting their coal, they would stop and wait for the ice to open. It seemed reasonable. The ice was always moving, always changing. Surely a lead would appear. They waited. The ice didn't open. February 14th, 1915. Meteorologist Leonard Hussey would remember this date for the rest of his life. Years later, as an old man, he described it in a radio interview. The temperature suddenly dropped from 20 degrees above zero to 20 degrees below it, and the whole sea froze over, and we froze in with it. The Weddell Sea had become solid ice. The Endurance was trapped. At first no one panicked. Ice moved. Ice shifted. They would wait for a lead to open, then continue on their way. But days passed and no lead appeared. A week passed. 2 weeks. The ice showed no sign of relenting. Then, a miracle. A lead opened 400 yards ahead of the ship. 400 yards between them and open water, 400 yards to freedom. Shackleton gave the order. The men attacked the ice with picks and shovels, hacking, chopping, desperately trying to carve a path through ice that was feet thick. Frank Hurley filmed their exhausting labor. For 48 hours they worked without stopping, driving themselves to the point of collapse, and then they had to stop. The remaining ice was simply too thick. 400 yards might as well have been 400 miles. They had failed. Some men wept, others cursed. Shackleton showed nothing. He gathered them together and spoke in a calm, matter-of-fact voice, as though this had been the plan all along. They would winter in the pack. They would drift with the ice until spring. Then they would continue. Dr. Macklin watched him carefully during this moment. Later he would write, "It was more than tantalizing. It was maddening." Shackleton at this time showed one of his sparks of real greatness. He did not rage at all, or show outwardly the slightest sign of disappointment. They had been stopped 1 day's sail from their destination, 1 day, but the ice had won. They would drift for 7 months, prisoners of forces utterly beyond their control. No one in the world knew where they were. They were beyond even radio contact, completely and utterly alone. Shackleton understood what this meant. 28 men, trapped together in close quarters, facing months of darkness and cold. Tensions would rise. Conflicts would erupt. He had seen it before, on Robert Falcon Scott's expedition, where poor leadership had allowed morale to collapse into hatred and despair. He would not let that happen. Shackleton instituted strict routines. Every man had duties, regardless of rank. When John Vincent, a heavyweight wrestling champion, was caught bullying the sailors, Shackleton summoned him to his cabin. Vincent emerged demoted. Everyone would work together, officers and sailors, scientists and craftsmen. Seaman Walter, Howe later remembered, everybody mucked in. It didn't matter who they were or what they were. Their qualifications didn't count for anything. This was revolutionary in class-obsessed Britain, but Shackleton understood that survival depended on unity. The ship became their world. In May, the sun disappeared below the horizon and wouldn't return until late July. For months they lived in perpetual darkness, lit only by lamps and the ghostly shimmer of the aurora australis. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, but Shackleton fought to maintain morale. Regular meals at regular times, celebrations for birthdays and holidays. Hussey played his banjo. They held theatrical evenings and concerts. There was even a haircutting tournament where the men gave each other ridiculous haircuts. Carpenter McNish wrote, "We do look a lot of convicts, and we are not much short of that life at present, but still hoping to get to civilization someday." The dogs became their companions, their connection to life and warmth. When 4 puppies were born, the entire crew was captivated. Tough Irish sailor Tom Crean nursed them with tender care that would have seemed absurd anywhere else. But beneath the routines and the forced cheer, something terrible was building. The pack ice wasn't static. It was alive, constantly moving, grinding, shifting. Enormous pressure built up within it, and when that pressure released, huge blocks of ice would buckle and thrust upward with explosive force. The noise was terrifying. Groaning, cracking, booms like artillery fire. The Endurance drifted north, carried along on a vast sheet of frozen ocean. After months trapped, the ship had traveled more than 1,000 miles. Where she would end up, no one could say. July brought a blizzard of such violence it seemed the ice itself was attacking. The ship shuddered and groaned. Captain Worsley recalled Shackleton coming to him during that storm and saying quietly, "The ship can't live in this, skipper. It's only a matter of time. What the ice gets, the ice keeps." But the Endurance survived. As winter turned to spring and the sun returned, hopes rose. Perhaps they would drift close enough to land to march. Perhaps the ice would release them. Perhaps, somehow, they would still achieve something. Then, in late October, the ice attacked with fury beyond anything they had imagined. The pressure was immense. Blocks of ice weighing hundreds of tons were thrust upward by forces that dwarfed human comprehension. The pressure found the Endurance's starboard side, lifted her bodily, squeezed her like a hand crushing a toy. The men heard timbers crack and splinter. The sound was like heavy fireworks, like blasting guns. Walter. Howe would never forget it. You couldn't avoid it. It was there like heavy fireworks and blasting of guns. The ice opened planks on the starboard side. Water flooded in. All hands manned the pumps, working in desperate shifts for 3 days and nights. Frank Hurley wrote, "The ship groans and quivers, windows splinter, while the deck timbers gape and twist. Amid these profound and overwhelming forces, we are the absolute embodiment of helpless futility." On October 27, 1915, 10 months after they'd been trapped, Shackleton gave the order every captain dreads: abandon ship. The men stood on the ice watching their home die. The Endurance had been their shelter, their protection against the hostile world. Now they had nothing but 3 lifeboats and whatever supplies they could carry. Shackleton gathered them and spoke words that Dr. Macklin would never forget. "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." His calm voice belied the night he had spent pacing the ice alone, confronting the collapse of everything he had worked for. Later he would write, "The thoughts that came to me in the darkness were not cheerful. The task now was to secure the safety of the party." His dream of crossing Antarctica was dead, but something else was being born, an almost fanatical determination to bring every man home alive. The expedition had been great, but the men had become more important. Shackleton had shifted from trying to achieve glory to trying to extract his men from disaster. That shift, that transformation from conquest to salvation, would define everything that followed. On November 21st, the Endurance finally sank beneath the ice. Shackleton recorded simply, "At 5 p.m. she went down. I cannot write about it." Now nothing remained except photographer Frank Hurley's images and the men's memories. They were stranded on a drifting ice floe, over 1,000 miles from civilization, beyond any hope of rescue. 28 men, 3 small boats, and an ocean of ice stretching away in every direction. Ernest Shackleton stood among his men and contemplated the impossible. He had lost his ship. He had lost his dream. Everything he had worked for was gone, but the men were still alive, and as long as they lived, there was a chance. He would get them home. He would bring them all back alive. This became his new obsession, the force that would drive him through the ordeals ahead. The expedition had failed, but the greatest test of Ernest Shackleton's leadership had only just begun. The Endurance lay at the bottom of the Weddell Sea, crushed and swallowed by the ice. Above her, on a frozen white plain that stretched to the horizon, 28 men sat shivering in the Antarctic wind. They had 3 small lifeboats, a handful of canvas tents, and the clothes on their backs. They were over 1,000 miles from the nearest human outpost. Nobody in the world knew they were there. They called their new home Ocean Camp. It was a bitter, desperate joke. There was no ocean visible, just a chaotic wasteland of jagged ice, and it was hardly a camp. It was a waiting room for death. Ernest Shackleton understood that sitting still meant surrendering to despair. He needed to keep his men moving. If they could drag their lifeboats across the ice to Paulet Island, some 350 miles to the west, they might find a cache of supplies left by a previous expedition. Before the march began, Shackleton gathered his men. He told them they could only bring 2 pounds of personal gear. Everything else had to be discarded. To prove his point, Shackleton reached into his parka, pulled out his heavy gold watch and his gold cigarette case, and dropped them into the snow. If the boss could throw away a fortune in gold, the men could throw away their extra socks. The only exception was meteorologist Leonard Hussey's banjo. Shackleton insisted they keep it, calling it vital mental medicine. The march was an absolute nightmare. The men harnessed themselves like draft animals, dragging boats that weighed over a ton across pressure ridges of shattered ice. They sank to their knees in freezing slush. They hacked through ice walls with pickaxes, only to find another wall waiting. After 3 days of backbreaking, soul-crushing agony, they calculated their progress. They had traveled barely 2 miles. They could still clearly see the wreckage of their previous camp. It was here that the expedition faced its first true fracture. Harry McNish, the expedition's 50-year-old Scottish carpenter, stopped walking. He dropped his harness, stood in the freezing wind, and declared he would not go another step. It was a mutiny, plain and simple. McNish argued that since the Endurance had sunk, his contract as a ship's carpenter was void. He owed Shackleton no obedience. The men stopped and watched. In the absolute isolation of the Antarctic ice, mutiny was a virus that could kill them all. If the hierarchy collapsed, they would butcher each other before the winter even set in. Shackleton did not yell. He did not draw a weapon. He approached McNish with a chilling, absolute authority. He read aloud the ship's articles, reminding the carpenter that their contract applied until they reached a safe port. He stared McNish down, radiating a quiet menace, making it perfectly clear that he would execute the man on the spot if he had to. The sheer force of Shackleton's personality won. McNish picked up his harness. The mutiny was crushed, but McNish had been right about one thing. The march was suicidal. Shackleton finally admitted defeat. They could not walk out of this. They would have to set up a permanent camp on the ice floe and pray that the ocean currents would drift them toward land. They named their new home Patience Camp. Patience was a luxury they were running out of. Days bled into weeks and weeks into months. The Antarctic summer brought no warmth, only a damp, miserable fog. They lived on a diet of seal and penguin meat, cooked over a stove fueled by animal blubber. Their clothes became stiff with frozen grease and blood. Dysentery swept through the camp. Then came the darkest day of the expedition. The sled dogs, the faithful animals that had kept the men's spirits alive through the long, dark winter, were starving. There was barely enough meat to keep the humans alive. Feeding the dogs was no longer mathematically possible. Shackleton gave the order to his second-in-command, Frank Wild. It was time to put the dogs down. Wild took the teams out one by one. The men sat in their tents, listening to the crack of the pistol echoing across the ice. Sailors wept openly, but the true horror of their situation was yet to come. Driven by starvation and a desperate need for calories, they butchered the very animals they had loved. Carpenter McNish, the hardened mutineer, wrote in his diary with heartbreaking bluntness that the dog meat was a treat after months of seal blubber. It was a line crossed, a stark realization of how feral their existence had become. By March of 1916, they had been living on the drifting ice for 5 months. And the ice was dying. The massive floe that had served as their floating island was slowly rotting beneath their boots, eaten away by warmer ocean currents. Pressure ridges buckled and smashed into their camp. Deep black cracks began to snake through the ice like spider webs. One pitch-black night the men were sleeping in their tents when the ice groaned with a deafening shriek. A crack tore straight through the middle of a tent. Shackleton, who was pacing outside, rushed over and looked down into the widening abyss. In the freezing black water below, a sailor named Ernie Holness was thrashing inside his zipped-up sleeping bag. Shackleton dropped to his knees, grabbed the edge of the sleeping bag, and hauled with every ounce of his strength. He dragged Holness onto the ice just as the two massive frozen edges slammed back together with the force of a train collision. Had Holness been in the water a second longer, he would have been crushed to paste. The message was clear. The ice was disintegrating. They could not wait any longer. On April 9th, Shackleton ordered the men into the 3 small lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. They pushed the boats off the crumbling edge of their ice floe and into the dark, churning waters of the Weddell Sea. What followed were 7 days of absolute, unmitigated hell. The boats were dangerously overcrowded, heavily ballasted with stones so they wouldn't flip in the swelling ocean. The temperature plunged to -5 degrees. The ocean spray instantly froze as it hit the men, encasing them in rigid shells of ice. They had to constantly beat the ice off the boats with axes, terrified the extra weight would sink them. There was no room to lie down. They sat shoulder to shoulder, shivering violently, their hands blistered and bleeding from rowing. Saltwater sores erupted on their skin. At night, the darkness was absolute. They navigated by dead reckoning, blind and freezing, listening to the terrifying roar of killer whales, surfacing just feet from their frail wooden hulls. Men began to lose their minds. Some hallucinated, others simply stopped moving, surrendering to the creeping warmth of severe hypothermia. Shackleton jumped from boat to boat, forcing men to eat, forcing them to row, refusing to let them die. On the 6th day, the wind rose to hurricane force. They were trapped in a massive gale, fighting waves that towered over their tiny boats like moving mountains. They bailed water until their arms went numb. Just as they reached the absolute limit of human endurance, just as the men began to drop their bailing tins in sheer exhaustion, a jagged shadow broke through the fog. Land! It was Elephant Island, a brutal, towering rock of glaciers and cliffs jutting out of the violent sea. It was the first solid ground they had seen in 497 days. They fought the currents for hours, desperate to find a landing spot. Finally, they surfed the boats onto a narrow rocky beach. Men tumbled over the sides. Some fell to their knees and kissed the stones. Others crawled to a small glacial stream and drank until they were sick. One man, driven completely mad by the ordeal, grabbed an axe and began mindlessly slaughtering a colony of seals on the beach, his sanity fracturing at the finish line. They had made it. They were off the ice. They were alive. But the euphoria did not last. As the sun rose the next day, the brutal reality of their situation snapped into focus. Elephant Island was a death trap. It was a desolate, frozen rock, battered by hurricane winds. There was no shelter. There was no vegetation. And worst of all, it was hundreds of miles outside of any known shipping lane. No whaler, no rescue ship, no human being would ever pass this way. They had escaped the ice only to strand themselves in an icy prison. If they stayed on this beach, they would slowly freeze and starve to death. Ernest Shackleton stood on the rocky shore, the wind tearing at his ragged coat, and looked out at the most violent, dangerous ocean on the planet. He knew what he had to do. He would have to take one of these tiny, battered rowboats and sail at 800 miles across the deadliest seas on Earth to find help. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only hope. The James Caird was 22.5 feet long. She was a lifeboat designed for coastal waters and calm weather, never meant to travel more than a few miles from shore. Ernest Shackleton was about to sail her 800 miles across the Scotia Sea, the most violent stretch of ocean on planet Earth. It was insanity. Everyone knew it, but there was no alternative. Carpenter Harry McNish worked like a man possessed, transforming the James Caird from a simple lifeboat into something that might survive the impossible. He scavenged wood from the other boats and raised her sides. He stretched canvas across the top to create a deck, sealing every gap with a grotesque mixture of oil paint and seal blood. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, but he never stopped. This boat was his masterpiece, his redemption. He had nearly mutinied on the ice. Now he was building the vessel that would save them all. Shackleton chose 5 men to accompany him. Frank Worsley would navigate, the most critical job of all. Tom Crean and Timothy McCarthy would provide seamanship and raw strength. John Vincent, the bully who had been demoted, earned his place through years on North Atlantic trawlers, and McNish, the mutinous carpenter, came because he had built the boat and understood her every weakness. Frank Wild, Shackleton's closest friend, would stay behind to command the 22 men on Elephant Island. The goodbye was brief, almost brutal in its simplicity. There was nothing to say that both men didn't already know. If Shackleton failed, everyone would die. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird pushed off from the beach. The men left behind cheered and waved until the boat disappeared over the horizon. Then the cheering stopped, and 22 men stood in silence on a frozen beach, wondering if they would ever see their companions again. The first 2 days were almost pleasant. The sun appeared, the wind was steady, the boat made good progress through moderate seas. The men even allowed themselves a dangerous flicker of hope. Then the ocean showed its teeth. The temperature plummeted, waves began breaking over the bow, drenching the men in freezing spray that turned to ice the moment it touched their clothes. Within hours they were encased in rigid shells of ice armor. They had to beat the ice off each other with their fists, terrified that the extra weight would sink the boat. They established a brutal routine. 2 teams of 3 men, rotating every 4 hours. One team worked above deck, steering, trimming sails, bailing the endless water that sloshed in the bottom of the boat. The other team crawled into the space beneath the canvas deck to rest, but rest was a fantasy. The cabin was a cramped, lightless coffin, barely 3 feet high. The floor was a chaos of sharp ballast stones. The reindeer hair sleeping bags, soaked with seawater, had frozen into solid blocks of ice. The men lay on top of them, shivering so violently their teeth cracked, counting the minutes until their next shift. By the 5th day, John Vincent began to break. The big man, so feared for his strength and cruelty, sat slumped in the stern, his eyes glazed and empty. He had stopped speaking. He barely moved when waves crashed over him. Shackleton watched him carefully, his fingers checking Vincent's pulse whenever he could. Hypothermia was setting in. Vincent was dying. Shackleton never let him know. Instead, he would suddenly announce that everyone needed a hot drink. He would order the Primus stove lit, a monumental task in the pitching, spray-soaked chaos of the boat. They would melt ice and make a weak, lukewarm mixture that was barely drinkable. But it was warm, and warmth meant life. Vincent would drink, and the light would return to his eyes for a few more hours. By the 8th day, Harry McNish was fading too. The old carpenter sat hunched in the bow, his hands swollen and black with frostbite, mumbling to himself. Shackleton forced hot drinks on him as well, never acknowledging the truth they both knew. McNish was too old for this. His body was giving up, but Shackleton would not let him die. Not after everything. The waves grew larger. The Southern Ocean is unique on Earth. With no landmass to break their path, waves circle Antarctica endlessly, building into moving mountains of water. Some reached 50 feet, towering over the tiny boat like collapsing buildings. The James Caird would climb each wave at a sickening angle, nearly vertical, threatening to slide backward and tumble end over end. Then she would crest and plunge down the far side, surfing at terrifying speed into the trough, where the next mountain was already rising. Captain Worsley stood at the tiller for hours at a time, lashed to the boat to keep from being swept overboard. He steered by feel through waves he could barely see, making micro-adjustments that kept them alive. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the wave would catch them sideways and roll them like a toy. Worsley made no mistakes. Navigation was nearly impossible. Worsley needed clear skies to shoot the sun with his sextant, but the clouds were relentless, and even when the sun appeared, the horizon vanished behind the massive waves. He had to wait for the precise moment when the boat crested a wave, then brace himself between two men and snap a reading before they plunged down the other side. In 16 days, Worsley took only 4 sextant sights. The rest of the time he navigated by dead reckoning and instinct, estimating their speed and direction through 800 miles of ocean. If he was wrong by even 1 degree, they would sail past South Georgia into oblivion. On the 10th night, something strange happened. Shackleton was at the tiller, alone in the darkness, when he felt it. A presence. He turned, expecting to see one of his men, but the stern was empty. Yet the feeling remained. Someone was there. Someone was watching over them. He said nothing, but weeks later, after they had reached safety, Worsley came to him privately. "Boss," he said, "I had the strangest feeling during the boat journey. It seemed like there were 4 of us in the boat, not 3. Shackleton nodded slowly. He had felt it too. They never spoke of it again. Some things could not be explained. By the 14th day, thirst had become worse than cold. They had water in small kegs, but seawater had contaminated it with salt. Drinking it made them desperately, agonizingly thirsty. Their tongues swelled. Their lips split open. Tom Crean began hallucinating, seeing rivers and green meadows. He reached over the side of the boat to scoop up water, convinced it was fresh. Shackleton grabbed his arm and pulled him back. And then, on the evening of the 15th day, a piece of kelp floated past. The men stared at it as if it were a religious vision. Kelp grew in shallow water. Shallow water meant land. Worsley scanned the horizon through salt-crusted eyes. And there, barely visible through the mist, were the peaks of South Georgia. For a moment no one spoke. No one moved. They had crossed 800 miles of the worst ocean on Earth. Frank Worsley had navigated to a target 30 miles wide using 4 sun sights and guesswork. It was impossible. But they had done it. Tom Crean began to laugh. It was a broken, half-mad sound, but it was laughter. They were going to live. But the ocean had one more test. That night, as they approached the coast, the wind rose to hurricane force. It was the worst storm of the entire journey, and it struck when they were at their weakest. Waves the size of buildings crashed over the boat. The men bailed frantically, knowing one wave could swamp them. For 9 hours Worsley fought the tiller, keeping the bow pointed into the wind, clawing them away from the cliffs, where waves exploded with the force of artillery. His hands were frozen to the wood. His body was lashed so tightly to the boat that the ropes cut through his clothes and into his skin, but he held them steady. Just before dawn the wind shifted. The hurricane passed. Exhausted beyond all measure, the James Caird limped into King Haakon Bay on the southern coast of South Georgia. On May 10, 1916, 17 days after leaving Elephant Island, the boat touched a beach of smooth stones. The 6 men stumbled out, unable to stand. Their legs had been cramped for so long they had forgotten how to walk. They crawled to a small stream and drank until they were sick. Tom Crean climbed a hill and lay down in the grass, weeping. It was the first vegetation he had seen in 17 months, but Shackleton stood on the beach, staring up at the mountains, and felt no relief. They had reached South Georgia. They had survived the boat journey, but they were on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations were on the northern coast, 20 miles away, across unmapped mountains that no human had ever crossed. The James Caird was destroyed, her seams split, barely afloat. McNish and Vincent could not survive another sea voyage. The boat journey was over. If Shackleton wanted to save his men, he would have to cross those mountains on foot. He looked at Worsley and Crean. Both men were starving, frostbitten, exhausted, but both men nodded. "We leave tomorrow," Shackleton said. Somewhere on the other side of those peaks, 22 men were waiting to be rescued, and Ernest Shackleton had never broken a promise in his life. 3 men stood at the base of a mountain range that had never been crossed. Behind them lay the wreckage of the James Caird and 3 men too broken to continue. Ahead lay 20 miles of unmapped glaciers, ice fields, and peaks that disappeared into the clouds. And somewhere on the other side, if they could survive the crossing, was salvation. Ernest Shackleton, Frank Worsley, and Tom Crean had exactly 36 hours to reach the whaling station at Stromness. Any longer and they would freeze to death in the mountains. They had no tent, no sleeping bags, no safety equipment of any kind. They carried a length of rope, a carpenter's adze that could serve as an ice axe, and a small amount of food. That was all. To sleep in the open at these altitudes and these temperatures meant death. They would have to march continuously, through day and night, without rest, until they reached the other side or died trying. The night before they left, Carpenter Harry McNish performed one final act of genius. Using screws salvaged from the James Caird, he turned the men's leather boots into improvised climbing boots, driving the screws through the soles to create crude cleats for gripping ice. It was a simple modification that would save their lives a dozen times over. At 3 o'clock in the morning on May 19, 1916, under a full moon and clear skies, the three men said goodbye to their companions and began to climb. The first hours were deceptively manageable. They climbed a steep slope of snow and scree, their breath burning in the thin, cold air. As dawn broke, they reached the first ridge and looked out over the interior of South Georgia. What they saw stopped them cold. The island was a chaos of razor-sharp peaks, massive glaciers that fell away into invisible crevasses, and valleys so deep they seemed to drop into the center of the earth. There was no map. No one had ever crossed this terrain. They had no idea which direction would lead them to safety, and which would lead them to a dead end. Shackleton made a decision based purely on instinct. They would head for the highest ridge they could see and navigate from there. It was a guess. Everything from this point forward would be a guess. They climbed for hours, ascending a steep snow slope that seemed to go on forever. Their legs burned, their lungs screamed for oxygen, but they pushed on, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant death. By mid-morning they reached what they thought was a summit. They crested the ridge, expecting to see the northern coast and the whaling stations in the distance. Instead, they found a sheer cliff dropping away into nothing. They stood at the edge, looking down at a precipice that fell hundreds of feet. There was no way down, no way around. They had climbed for hours in the wrong direction. Shackleton felt the weight of failure pressing down on him. They had wasted precious time and energy. The men on Elephant Island were counting on him. McNish and Vincent and McCarthy were waiting on the beach, too weak to survive more than a few days. And here he was, standing at the edge of a cliff with no way forward. But he did not panic. He never panicked. He simply turned around and led his men back down the way they had come. They tried a different route, climbing toward a different ridge. Again they climbed for hours. Again they crested what seemed like a summit. And again they found themselves staring down an impassable precipice. The pattern repeated itself throughout the day. Climb, dead end, descend, try again. Each failure cost them time they did not have. The sun was falling toward the horizon. Night was coming, and night in these mountains meant death. By late afternoon they stood on yet another ridge, exhausted and desperate. Below them was a steep slope that seemed to descend into a valley on the far side, but the slope was covered in fog. They could not see the bottom. They had no idea if it was a gradual descent or another cliff face. Shackleton made a calculation. It was growing dark. They were running out of time. If they turned back and tried another route, they would be caught in the mountains after nightfall. They would freeze. They had to go down, now. But the slope was too steep to climb down safely. The ice was hard and slick. One slip and they would slide out of control, accelerating until they hit rocks or tumbled into a crevasse. Shackleton looked at his two companions. "We've got to take a risk," he said. "Are you game?" Worsley and Crean stared at the slope disappearing into the fog. They understood what Shackleton was proposing. It was insane. But everything about this journey had been insane. They nodded. The three men sat down in the snow. They coiled their rope into a makeshift pad and positioned it beneath them. Then without another word they pushed off and began to slide. They accelerated instantly, shooting down the slope at terrifying speed. The wind screamed in their ears. Snow exploded around them. They could see nothing through the fog, had no idea what lay ahead, whether they were sliding toward safe ground or toward a cliff edge that would launch them into space. Worsley would later say that after the initial terror passed, he felt an unexpected sensation. Joy. For weeks they had been cold, starving, and exhausted. Now for a few brief seconds they were flying. The slide seemed to last forever. Then quite suddenly they hit a bank of soft snow at the bottom and tumbled to a stop. For a moment they lay there in silence, too stunned to move. Then Shackleton began to laugh. Worsley joined in. Crean laughed so hard he could barely breathe. They were alive. Against all logic and reason they were alive. They picked themselves up, shook hands solemnly, and continued walking. But the mountains were not finished with them. As darkness fell they entered a landscape of nightmare. The glacier beneath their feet was broken and unstable, riddled with hidden crevasses that could swallow a man whole. They roped themselves together and moved slowly, testing each step, terrified that the snow would collapse beneath them, and they would plunge into the black depths of the glacier. At one point, Crean stepped forward and the snow gave way. He dropped through the surface, his legs kicking in empty air. Shackleton and Worsley threw themselves backward, using their weight to stop his fall. They hauled him back up, his face white with shock. Below him the crevasse fell away into darkness so complete they could not see the bottom. They moved even more carefully after that. Each step was a negotiation with death. By midnight they had been marching for 21 hours without rest. Their bodies were shutting down. Worsley began to hallucinate, seeing buildings and lights that weren't there. Crean stumbled and nearly fell. Even Shackleton, who seemed immune to exhaustion, felt the edges of his vision going dark. They stopped on a small plateau, just for a moment, just to catch their breath. Shackleton sat down in the snow. Within seconds he felt sleep pulling at him like a drug. It would be so easy to close his eyes, just for a few minutes, just to rest. He snapped awake, his heart pounding. He looked over at Worsley and Crean. Both men were already asleep, slumped in the snow. Shackleton knew that if they slept they would never wake up. The cold would take them gently, painlessly, permanently. He waited exactly 5 minutes. Then he shook his companions awake. "You've been asleep for half an hour," he lied. "Time to move." The lie saved their lives. Worsley and Crean, believing they had rested, found the strength to stand. They continued walking. This happened twice more during the night. Each time Shackleton let them sleep for 5 minutes, then woke them claiming half an hour had passed. Each time, the lie gave them the psychological boost they needed to continue. At dawn, they climbed one final ridge, and there, spread out below them in the gray morning light, was Stromness Bay. They could see the whaling station, they could see buildings, smokestacks, ships in the harbor, they could see civilization. Tom Crean dropped to his knees and wept. They had crossed the unmapped interior of South Georgia in 36 hours of continuous marching. They had navigated by instinct through a labyrinth of peaks and glaciers. They had survived falls, crevasses, and exposure that should have killed them a dozen times over, but they were not there yet. Between them and the whaling station was one final obstacle, a steep waterfall cascading down a cliff face. There was no way around it. They would have to climb down beside the waterfall, or find another route that could take hours they no longer had. Shackleton made a decision. They would climb down. They tied their rope to a boulder at the top of the cliff and began to descend, one man at a time, beside the freezing waterfall. The rope was barely long enough. The rocks were slick with ice and spray. One slip would mean a fall of over 100 feet under the rocks below. Worsley went first, lowering himself hand over hand, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the icy rocks. He reached the bottom safely. Then Crean descended. Finally, Shackleton climbed down, his frozen fingers barely able to grip the rope. When all three men stood at the bottom of the waterfall, they looked at each other and realized they had nothing left to say. They had done the impossible. Words seemed inadequate. They walked the final mile to Stromness whaling station in silence. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on May 20th, 1916, three ragged, filthy figures emerged from the mountains and approached the whaling station. They were covered in soot from blubber stoves. Their clothes were in tatters. Their hair and beards were long and matted. They looked like men returning from the dead. They knocked on the door of the station manager's house. A man opened it and stared at them in shock and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. "My name is Shackleton," came the reply. The manager, Thorolf Sorel, stared at him in disbelief. He had known Shackleton years before, when the Endurance had stopped at South Georgia on her way south, but he could not recognize this broken, emaciated figure standing before him. Then, slowly, recognition dawned. Sorel's face went pale. "My God," he whispered. "When did you leave?" "We left in December, 1914, Shackleton said. "We've been away for a while." Sorel invited them inside. The three men sat at a table while the manager's wife brought them food and hot coffee. They tried to eat, but their stomachs, shrunken by months of starvation, could barely handle the rich food. They ate slowly, mechanically, like men who had forgotten what food tasted like. Sorel asked about the expedition. Shackleton told him the Endurance had been lost, that 22 men were stranded on Elephant Island, that 3 more were waiting on the other side of South Georgia, that he needed a ship immediately to mount a rescue. Sorel listened in stunned silence. The story seemed impossible. No one could survive what Shackleton was describing, but here he was, sitting in Sorel's home, asking for a ship with the same quiet determination he might use to ask for a cup of tea. That night Shackleton slept in a real bed for the first time in over a year, but his sleep was troubled. In his dreams he saw the faces of the men on Elephant Island, waiting for a rescue that might never come. The next morning Sorel provided a whaling ship to sail around South Georgia and retrieve the 3 men at King Haakon Bay. The journey took only a few hours by sea, a stark contrast to the 36-hour nightmare crossing over the mountains. When the ship arrived at the beach, McNish, Vincent, and McCarthy were waiting. They had survived on seal meat and melted ice, barely clinging to life. When they saw the ship, they could barely believe it was real. McNish, the carpenter who had built the James Caird with his own bleeding hands, was too weak to walk. He had to be carried aboard. Vincent, the bully who had broken during the boat journey, stared at Shackleton with hollow eyes and said nothing. McCarthy, the tough Irish sailor, managed a weak smile. All 6 men from the James Caird were now safe, but 22 men remained on Elephant Island, over 800 miles away across the same brutal ocean they had just crossed, and winter was coming. Shackleton chartered a Norwegian whaling ship and set out immediately for Elephant Island, but 60 miles from the island they encountered the pack ice. It was thick, impenetrable, and growing thicker every day as winter set in. The ship could not break through. The captain refused to risk his vessel. They had no choice but to turn back. Shackleton was devastated. He had crossed South Georgia. He had reached civilization, but he could not reach his men. He tried again, and again, and again. Over the next 4 months, Shackleton made 3 more desperate attempts to reach Elephant Island. Each time the ice defeated him. Each time he had to turn back, knowing his men were starving, freezing, dying while he was powerless to help them. The frustration was unbearable. Shackleton had promised to rescue them. He had promised to bring them home, and he could not keep that promise. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, the 22 men lived in a nightmare of their own. They had built a crude shelter by overturning the 2 remaining boats and piling stones around them to create walls. The shelter was barely 10 feet wide and 20 feet long. 22 men lived in this dark, cramped space, unable to stand upright, unable to move without stepping on each other. The roof leaked. Snow drifted in through gaps in the stones. The floor was perpetually wet and cold. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, blubber smoke, and despair. They survived on seal and penguin meat when they could catch it, but game was scarce. There were days when they ate nothing at all. Their bodies began to consume themselves, burning muscle for fuel, shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy. Frank Wild, left in command, did everything he could to maintain morale. Every morning he would rouse the men from their sleeping bags with the same words, "Lash up and stow, boys. The boss may come today." At first the men believed it. They would rush outside, scanning the horizon for a ship. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and no ship appeared. By August, even Wild had stopped believing Shackleton would return. How could he? They had been on the island for 4 months. Surely the boss had perished in the boat journey. Surely they were on their own now. The men began to plan a desperate final gamble. They would take one of the boats and sail to Deception Island, hopping from island to island across 250 miles of open ocean. It was a suicide mission, but staying on Elephant Island was also suicide. Just slower. On August 30th, 1916, the men huddled in their dark shelter, eating their meager rations of boiled seal backbone. Outside, a blizzard was raging. They had long since stopped going outside to look for rescue ships. What was the point? Then George Marston, the expedition artist, stuck his head into the shelter. "Wild," he said quietly. "There's a ship." For a moment no one moved. They had imagined this moment so many times that it no longer seemed real. "It's a ship," Marston repeated. Wild crawled outside. Through the blowing snow he saw a small tugboat offshore, and standing at the bow, scanning the beach through binoculars, was Ernest Shackleton. Wild began counting the figures emerging from the shelter. He counted every man, terrified that someone had died while he wasn't paying attention. 1, 2, 3, 7, 10, 15, 20, 22 men, all alive. On board the tugboat, Shackleton counted the same figures through his binoculars. When he reached 22, he lowered the binoculars and turned to Worsley and Crean, who were standing beside him. "They're all there, Skipper," he said, his voice breaking. "They're all safe." All 3 men stood in silence, unable to speak. The small Chilean tugboat, the Yelcho, had finally broken through the ice where larger ships had failed. After 4 months and 4 failed attempts, Shackleton had kept his promise. The men on the beach launched their small boat and rowed out to the Yelcho. When they climbed aboard, they were almost unrecognizable. Their clothes were rags held together with seal sinew. Their faces were hollow and gaunt. Some had lost half their body weight, but they were alive. Every single one of them was alive. Shackleton moved among them, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, his eyes searching each face to make sure they were truly there, truly safe. He had nightmares about this moment going wrong, about arriving to find them dead or missing, but they were all there. The Yelcho turned north and steamed toward civilization. When they arrived at Punta Arenas, Chile, on September 3, 1916, they received a welcome that stunned them. The entire town turned out to greet them. Flags were raised, bands played. Even the German community, despite being at war with Britain, raised their flags in celebration. The story of Shackleton's expedition had captured imaginations around the world. Against impossible odds, he had brought every single man home alive. Not one life had been lost. But when the crew of the Endurance returned to Britain, they found a nation that had changed beyond recognition. They had left in August 1914, when the Great War was just beginning, and men still thought it would be over by Christmas. They returned in late 1916, after the Battle of the Somme had killed over 1 million men in a few months. Britain had no interest in Antarctic explorers. Britain wanted dead heroes, and it had plenty of them. The newspapers barely mentioned Shackleton's return. The public, numb from years of industrial slaughter, could not muster enthusiasm for men who had merely survived. Shackleton felt the sting of irrelevance. He had achieved something extraordinary, but the world had moved on without him. The heroic age of exploration was over, killed by the same war that was killing everything else. Most of the men enlisted and went to fight. Tom Crean joined the Royal Navy. Frank Worsley went to command a ship in the war. Tim McCarthy, the tough Irish sailor who had survived the boat journey, was killed at sea just 6 weeks after enlisting. He had survived the Antarctic only to die in the North Atlantic, torpedoed by a German U-boat. Harry McNish, the brilliant carpenter who had built the James Caird and crossed South Georgia, immigrated to New Zealand. He worked on the docks, his frostbitten hands never fully recovering. He lived in poverty and died alone. When the polar medals were awarded for the expedition, McNish was among the handful of men who did not receive one. Shackleton never forgave his brief mutiny on the ice. The carpenter's moment of rebellion cost him the recognition he deserved. Shackleton himself struggled to find purpose in the post-war world. He was restless, unable to settle into ordinary life. In 1921, he organized one final expedition to the Antarctic. The goal was vague. All that mattered was that he was heading south again. Several of the old Endurance crew joined him: Worsley, Macklin, Hussey, and Frank Wild. They were heading south one more time, chasing something they could not name, searching for something they had lost. On January 5, 1922, the expedition arrived at South Georgia. That night, Shackleton suffered a massive heart attack in his cabin. Dr. Macklin rushed to his side, but there was nothing he could do. Ernest Shackleton died at the age of 47, his heart finally giving out after years of impossible strain. At his wife's request, he was buried on South Georgia, the island he had crossed in his greatest triumph. His grave sits in the small whaling cemetery at Grytviken, overlooking the ocean he had conquered. Frank Wild and the remaining crew continued the expedition, though no one quite knew why. Along the way, they stopped at Elephant Island, the place where 22 men had waited in darkness, wondering if rescue would ever come. Hussey, the meteorologist who had brought his banjo, recorded their visit. The men stood on the beach, staring at the pile of stones that had been their shelter, and were overcome with unexpected emotion. Dr. Macklin wrote, "We stood gazing with binoculars, picking out and recognizing old familiar spots. Ah, what memories, what memories! They rush to one like a great flood, and bring tears to one's eyes. I see the old faces and hear the old voices, old friends scattered everywhere." The Endurance expedition had failed in its stated goal. They never crossed the Antarctic continent. They never achieved the glory Shackleton had sought for so long. But in failure, they had accomplished something greater. They had survived. Against odds that should have killed them 100 times over, they had endured. Shackleton once wrote, "We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man." In the end, the expedition was not about geography or records or fame. It was about what human beings can endure when pushed to the absolute limit. It was about loyalty, leadership, and the refusal to abandon those who depend on you. Ernest Shackleton brought every single man home alive. In the long history of polar exploration, littered with frozen corpses and failed expeditions, that simple fact stands as his monument: not one life lost. 28 men went into the ice. 28 men came home. By endurance, they conquered.